And we're live. Assignments coming up. Remember, we have this response paper due next Wednesday, and poetry for March 24th. These are the only assignments right now. We should get most of the way, if not all the way, done with the Tales from Shakespeare version of Romeo and Juliet today. I do also want to talk a little bit about the third one of these. For your Romeo and Juliet poetry recitation. So we talked about the prologue already, and then the duet sonnet when they first meet. And then the other speech on the front here, Romeo's speech in the balcony scene from this scene that we already read about, where after the party when they first meet, he sneaks into her backyard. And without knowing that he's there, Juliet comes out onto the balcony above the garden and declares how in love with him she is. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. I'll read through it once, and then we'll take a look at the first 8 or so lines. That'll be all for today. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief, that thou, her maid, art far more fair than she. Be not her maid, since she is envious. Her vestal livery is but sick and green, and none but fools do wear it. Cast it off. It is my lady. Oh, it is my love. Oh, that she knew she were. She speaks, yet she says nothing. What of that? Her eye discourses. I will answer it. I'm too bold. 'Tis not to me she speaks. 2 of the fairest stars in all the heaven, having some business, do entreat her eyes to twinkle in their spheres till they return. What if her eyes were there, they in her head? The brightness of her cheek would shame those stars, as daylight doth a lamp. Her eyes in heaven would through the airy region stream so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. See how she leans her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that I were... right towards the beginning. But soft. What does he mean here, soft? Be quiet, but soft. Quiet.
Like speaking softly.
Right, like speaking softly. Right, soft here means quiet. What light through yonder window breaks? Yonder window, the window over there. What light is breaking through that window? Like the break of dawn, or the break of day. It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. What here? So Juliet he had compared her to a saint earlier, and here he compares her to what?
The sun.
The sun rising in the east. It's nighttime. It's after this party, and it's like the dawn is breaking through this window, like the sun is rising through the window. It is the east. And Juliet is the sun rising in the east. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief, that thou, her maid, art far more fair than she. Okay. Arise and kill the envious moon. The moon, it's night.
It wants to be night. Is that what it means by envious?
Right, the moon is envious of the sun's beauty, here of Juliet's beauty, because it's supposed to be dark. It's supposed to be nighttime. And the moon wants things to be dark, but Juliet here is breaking like the sunrise from the window. The sun should come up and kill the envious moon, so the moon will no longer be visible. The moon is already sick and pale with grief. What does he mean here? The moon is already sick and pale with grief.
I don't know. I don't get the grief part.
Pale because it's really wide.
Right, the moon has a much paler color than the sun. A very different color than the sun. The moon is pale, sick and pale. It's not a beautiful kind of pale. It's a sickly sort of pale, he says. Juliet is like the golden sun rising. The moon here looks sickly by comparison. And pale with grief. What is this grief here? What is grief? Not necessarily.
Well, when you grieve, it's like after somebody dies, you grieve.
Right. Yeah, grief is sorrow. The moon is sick and pale with sorrow. The moon is sad here that thou, you, the sun, her maid, art far more fair than she. He says the sun here is the maid of the moon. The moon is the one in charge here. Sort of an interesting statement. I mean, we would think of the sun as being the the higher one in that relationship. But here he says the moon is like the lady and the sun is her maid, but the maid is more fair, is more beautiful. Be not her maid, since she is envious. Don't be the servant to this envious mistress. Her vestal livery is but sick and green, and none but fools do wear it. Cast it off. So you have to know what livery is here. This is not something that people talk about anymore. Livery is the outfits that servants would wear.
Like an apron?
So if you think like the sort of stereotypical bit, but livery in particular is more of a medieval thing where the colors that the servants would wear would be different depending on who their master was. You know, so if your master say that his coat of arms are blue and silver, then the livery of his servants would probably also be blue and silver. So just by looking at them, they'd have a unified appearance, and you could tell whose servants they were just by looking at them. Like they were all traveling together, look pretty impressive. They're all in matching outfits. That's livery. Vestal means related to clothing. If you're her maid, are sick and green, pale and green here. Pale name compared to the golden tone of the sun. And none but fools do wear it. Only fools wear it. Only fools are the maids of the moon. Cast it off. Take it off. Here, Juliet is like the sun, he says, and the sun shouldn't serve the moon, but rather should wear her own colors. We might also think about how up until this point, up until that party, Romeo had been obsessed with this other woman, Rosalie. Now he's forgotten about her. Maybe think about a comparison there. She's like the moon compared to Juliet being the sun. Yes, the moon is beautiful, but compared to the sun is this golden, radiant, warm, bright thing. Okay, we'll come back to that tomorrow. Tests graded in the next day or two, certainly by the end of the week. I'll get those graded back to you. We are here on page, where is it? Here it is, 255. So we saw there's this fight that breaks out shortly after Romeo and Juliet's secret wedding between his friends and Tybalt. Tybalt kills one of Romeo's friends, Romeo kills Tybalt, and as a result, he's banished. After spending the night with Juliet, there's this plan made where he's going to leave, go to Mantua, which is nearby. He'll stay there, and Friar Lawrence is going to keep him updated. With the plan being to make the marriage known publicly, and then once things have calmed down, he's hoping Romeo will be allowed to come back, and things will be resolved. So here we're starting with the first full paragraph on 255, about 10 lines down from the top. This was but the beginning of the tragedy of this pair of star-crossed lovers. Romeo had not been gone many days before the old Lord Capulet proposed a match for Juliet. The husband he had chosen for her, not dreaming that she was married already, was Count Paris, a gallant, young, and noble gentleman, no unworthy suitor to the young Juliet, if she had never seen Romeo. The terrified Juliet was in a sad perplexity at her father's offer. She pleaded her youth unsuitable to marriage, the recent death of Tybalt, which had left her spirits too weak to be the husband with any face of joy, and how indecorous improper. It would show for the family of the Capulets to be celebrating a nuptial feast, a marriage feast, when his funeral solemnities were hardly over. She pleaded every reason against the match, but the true one, namely that she was married already. Every reason but the true one. But Lord Capulet was deaf to all her excuses, and in a peremptory manner ordered her to get ready, for by the following Thursday she should be married to Paris. And having found her a husband, rich, young, and noble, such as the proudest maid in Verona might joyfully accept, he could not bear that out of an affected coyness, as he construed her denial, she should oppose obstacles to her own good fortune. Again, another incident where we have mistakes being made, some knowingly and some unknowingly. Her father says, hey, there's this guy Paris, I want you to marry him. Seems like a good match. Unfortunately, he's not aware that she's already married. Juliet pleads with him, don't make me do that. But she doesn't tell him the real reason behind it. Understandable why she would be afraid to. But all her other arguments are unsuccessful. She had resolution to undertake a desperate remedy, and she answering that she would go into the grave alive rather than marry Paris, her own dear husband living. He directed her to go home and appear married and give her consent to marry Paris according to her father's desire. And on the next night, which was the night before the marriage, to drink off the contents of a vial which he then gave her, the effects of which would be that for 42 hours after drinking it, she should appear cold and lifeless. When the bridegroom came to fetch her in the morning, he would find her to appearance dead. That then she would be born, as the manner in that country was, uncovered on a bier, that's a platform that you carry a dead body on, to be buried in the family vault. That if she could put off womanish fear and consent to this, he would let her husband know their drift, and he should come in the night and bear her thence to Mantua. Love and the dread of marrying Paris gave young Juliet strength to undertake this horrible adventure, and she took the vial of the friar, promising to observe his directions. Going from the monastery, she met the young Count Paris, and modestly dissembling, promised to become his bride. This was joyful news to the Lord Capulet and his wife. It seemed to put youth into the old man, and Juliet, who had displeased him exceedingly by her refusal of the Count, was his darling again. Now she promised to be obedient. All things in the house were in a bustle against the approaching nuptials. No cost was spared to prepare such festival rejoicings as Verona had never before witnessed. On the Wednesday night, Juliet drank off the potion. She had many misgivings, lest the friar, to avoid the blame which might be imputed to him for marrying her to Romeo, had given her poison. But then he was always known for a holy man. Then, lest she should awake before the time that Romeo was to come for her, whether the terror of the place, a vault full of dead Capulet's bones, and where Tybalt, all bloody, lay festering in his shroud, would not be enough to drive her distracted. Again, she thought of all the stories she had heard of spirits haunting the places where their bodies were. When this complication arises of her father wanting her to marry Paris, Friar Lawrence, again, comes up with an idea he thinks is going to solve everything. What's the plan here? What does he tell Juliet to do?
Just drink this poison. Makes her look like she's just a...
Right, she's going to drink this potion, and she's going to seem to be dead. And then what's going to happen? What's he say is going to happen when she's dead? Or once they think that she's dead? Read on 256. When the bridegroom, that's Paris, came to fetch her in the morning, he would find her to appearance dead, and then she would be born, as the manner in that country was, uncovered on a bier, to be buried in the family vault. Says they'll think that you're dead, and they'll take you to be buried. Burial, something that before the 19th century generally had to happen pretty quickly. There's no refrigeration. There's no, and then she'll wake up, he says, in the tomb, and he is going to let her husband know their drift, and he should come in the night and bear her thence to Mantua. Romeo will come and rescue her before she awakes. Juliet, understandably, is sort of concerned. She goes through with this. But she's worried about a number of things. At the bottom of 256, she had many misgivings. Lest be in trouble. So maybe he's given her poison. Then nobody will ever find out about that. Then she worries, my dead ancestors' bones. Tybalt, only just recently buried there. Bloody, rotting underneath a shroud. Maybe there are spirits there. But finally she takes it. Continuing towards the top of 257. When young Paris came early in the morning with music to awaken his bride, instead of a living Juliet, her chamber presented the dreary spectacle of a lifeless corpse. That's a corpse. What depth to his hopes! What confusion then reigned through the whole house! Poor Paris, lamenting his bride, whom most detestable death had beguiled him of, had divorced from him even before their hands were joined. But still more piteous it was to hear the mournings of the old Lord and Lady Capulet, who having but this one poor loving child to rejoice and solace in, cruel death had snatched her from their sight, just as these careful parents were on the point of seeing her advanced, as they thought, by a promising and advantageous match. Now all things that were ordained for the festival were turned from their properties to do the service of a black funeral. The way had been strewed in the bride's path, now served but to strew her course. Now instead of a priest to marry her, a priest was needed to bury her. And she was borne to church indeed, not to augment the cheerful hopes of the living, but to swell the dreary numbers of the dead. Something that we've talked about, I've mentioned a couple times before, a common feature of tragedy, death, obviously, but specifically what we call dramatic irony. Remember, irony is when things happen that people don't expect. Like, it was ironic. One semester when I was in college, I was studying in Germany. And it was in the headlines then that the woman who, that was ironic. You wouldn't expect somebody who's the top person running education in a country, especially Germany, to have plagiarized something so important as that. Irony can be funny. You can make jokes when things are ironic. Match. They've got everything ready. They've got food for the party. They've got music. They've got the church booked. They've got flowers. And instead, they wake up in the morning, and as far as they can tell, she's dead. So they've still got the musicians. They've still got the church booked. They still have the flowers. But they're going there for a very different reason. Instead of rejoicing, they're mourning. That's a good example of dramatic irony. And we're going to see some more instances of dramatic irony here in tragedy. In this tragedy specifically. From the bottom of 257. Bad news, which always travels faster than good, now brought the dismal story of his Juliet's death to Romeo at Mantua before the messenger could arrive, who was sent from Friar Lawrence, to apprise him that these were mock funerals only, and but the shadow and representation of death, and that his dear lady lay in the tomb but for a short while, expecting when Romeo would come to release her from that dreary mansion. Just before, Romeo had been and breathed such life with kisses in his lips that he revived and was an emperor. And now that a messenger came from Verona, he thought surely it was to confirm some good news which his dreams had presaged. But when the contrary to this flattering vision appeared, and that it was his lady who was dead in truth, whom he could not revive, and as mischief is swift to enter into the thoughts of desperate men, he called to mind a poor apothecary, that's a pharmacist, whose shop in Mantua he had lately passed. And from the beggarly appearance of the man, who seemed famished, and the wretched show in his shop of empty boxes ranged on dirty shelves, and other tokens of extreme wretchedness, he had said at the time, perhaps having some misgivings that his own disastrous life might happily meet with conclusions so desperate, if a man were to need poison, which by the law of Mantua it is death to sell, here lives a poor wretch who would sell it to him. These words of his now came into his mind, and he sought out the apothecary, who, after some pretended scruples, Romeo offering him gold which his poverty could not resist, sold him a poison, which, if he swallowed, he told him, if he had the strength of 20 men, would quickly dispatch him. Again, more dramatic irony. Romeo has this dream, this happy dream about Juliet, and then he hears in the morning that she's dead. However, he now thinks that she's dead, but the message from Friar Lawrence that this is all a plot hasn't reached him. There's another irony here. And Romeo thinks that she's dead, and in fact she isn't. And he's so upset by this that on his way he goes to this pharmacist and he gets him to sell him a poison illegally. With this poison, bottom of 258, he set out for Verona to have a sight of his dear lady in her tomb, meaning when he had satisfied his sight to swallow the poison and be buried by her side. He reached Verona at midnight and found the churchyard, in the midst of which was situated the ancient tomb of the Capulets. He had provided a light and a spade, a shovel, and wrenching iron, it's a crowbar, and was proceeding to break open the monument when he was interrupted by a voice, which by the name of vile Montague bade him desist from his unlove of her that should have been his bride. He knew not what an interest Romeo had in the dead, but knowing him to be a Montague, and as he supposed a sworn foe to all the Capulets, he judged that he was come by night to do some villainous shame to the dead bodies. Therefore, in an angry tone he bade him desist, and as a criminal condemned by the laws of Verona to die if he were found within the walls of the city, he would have apprehended him. Romeo urged Paris to leave him, and warned him, by the fate of Tybalt who lay buried there, not to provoke his anger, or draw down another sin upon his head by forcing him to kill him. But the Count in scorn refused his warning, and laid hands on him as a felon, which Romeo resisting, they fought, and Paris fell. When Romeo, by the help of a light, came to see who it was that he had slain, that it was Paris, who he had warned in his way from Mantua should have married Juliet, he took the dead youth by the hand, as one whom misfortune had made a companion, and said that he would bury him in a triumphal grave, meaning in Juliet's grave, which he now opened. And there lay his lady, as one whom death had no power upon to change a feature or complexion in her matchless beauty, or as if death were amorous, were a lover, and the lean abhorred monster kept her there for his delight, for she lay yet fresh and blooming, as she had fallen to sleep when she swallowed that benumbing potion. And near her lay Tybalt in his bloody shroud, when Romeo, seeing, begged pardon of his lifeless course, and for Juliet's sake called him cousin, and said that he was about to do him a favor by putting his enemy to death. Here, Romeo took his last leave of his lady's lips, kissing them. And here he shook the burden of his crossed stars from his weary body, swallowing that poison which the apothecary had sold him, whose operation was real, was fatal and real, not like that dissembling potion which Juliet had swallowed, the effect of which was now early expiring, and she about to awake to complain that Romeo had not kept his time, or that he had come too soon. For now the hour was Romeo, came himself, provided with a pickaxe and lantern, to deliver the lady from her confinement. But he was surprised to find a light already burning in the Capulets' monument, and to see swords and blood near it, and Romeo and Paris lying breathless by the monument. Before he could entertain a conjecture to imagine how these fatal accidents had fallen out, Juliet awoke out of her trance, and seeing the friar near her, she remained asleep. For a greater power than they could contradict had thwarted their intents, and being frightened by the noise of people coming, he fled. But when Juliet saw the cup closed in her true love's hands, she guessed that poison had been the cause of his end, and she would have swallowed the dregs if any had been left. And she kissed his still warm lips to try if any poison yet did hang upon them. Then, hearing a nearer noise of people coming, she quickly unsheathed the dagger. Romeo wants to pay Juliet one final visit. Unfortunately for both of them, or at least for Paris, Paris happens to be there. He's brought some flowers for Juliet's grave. He obviously has no idea what's going on. He has no idea that Romeo is actually Juliet's husband. He knows that Romeo killed Tybalt. He knows that he's not allowed to be there, and he knows that he's a monster. And so fights Romeo and dies.
That's wild.
Yeah.
All that is just for miscommunication.
Yeah, and right. It's just miscommunication. That's why it's a tragedy, because it's a small thing. There are so many links in this chain of events that if they'd gone slightly differently, things would have turned out differently. If Romeo if the messenger had been able to get to Romeo from Friar Lawrence, if Juliet's father hadn't decided to marry her to Paris quite so quickly, if Romeo had arrived a little bit later and Juliet had already been awake, there are a lot of little things that easily could have gone right, but they went wrong, and that's where the fear and the pity both come from there. These sorts of things happen in our lives also. Small little things happen. You make little mistakes. Things go wrong in slightly unpredictable ways, but not really surprising ways. And sometimes it turns out really poorly. If things just don't work out. If the stars line up in Lawrence, he rushes to the tomb because he knows what might happen. He has to go rescue Juliet because Romeo doesn't know about this. And he sees Romeo dead. He tells Juliet, look, you got to get out of here. He says, this is the bottom of 260. The friar, hearing a noise, bade him come out of that place of death and of unnatural sleep. For a greater power than they could contradict had thwarted their intents. This is fate. This is some sort of divine thing that we can't fight against. Look, you need to leave because we can't fight against this. And then, in this moment where she probably most needs his support, he runs away. And she takes her own life. Paris in particular, there's something very tragic about him. He is entirely blameless in this whole thing. He's, a wealthy, respectable young man. Lord Capulet says, look, I think you'd be a good match for my daughter. He says, great. They make preparations. She even tells him, yeah, great. I look forward to marrying you or whatever. And the next morning he shows up. He's got musicians doing what I think he should have been doing. He was defending her honor after death as well. As far as he knows, Romeo's an enemy of the family, one of the people in the tomb he killed, and they've also had another recent tragic death in the family. He doesn't know what he's up to, but it can't be anything good. Plus, he's not even supposed to be in Verona on pain of death. So, Paris in particular, there's something not strictly speaking tragic because he doesn't really make a mistake. I guess you could say tragic. There's a tragedy there too, in that there are these things that he's unaware of. He shows up at the wrong time there. If he had come a little bit earlier to bring this. Yes. All right. So getting close to the conclusion here, towards the top of 261, Juliet has just taken her life. The watch by this time had come up to the place. A page belonging to Count Paris, that's like his a young servant, usually one who's helps him with his armor and his weapons. A page belonging to Count Paris, who had witnessed the fight between his master and Romeo, had given the alarm, which had spread among the citizens, who went up and down the streets of Verona, confusedly exclaiming, Paris, Romeo, Juliet, as the rumor had imperfectly reached them, till the uproar brought Lord Montague and Lord Capulet out of their beds with the prince, to inquire into the causes of the disturbance. The friar had been apprehended by some of the watch, coming from the churchyard trembling, sighing, and weeping in a suspicious manner. A great multitude being assembled at the Capulets' monument, the friar was demanding he faithfully related the story of their children's fatal love, the part he took in promoting their marriage, in the hope in that union to end the long quarrels between their families. How Romeo, there dead, was husband to Juliet, and Juliet, there dead, was Romeo's faithful wife. How before he could find a fit opportunity to divulge their marriage, another match was projected for Juliet, who, to avoid the crime of a second marriage, swallowed the sleeping draught, as he advised, and all thought her dead. How meantime he wrote to Romeo to come and take her thence, when the force of the potion should cease. And by what unfortunate miscarriage of the messenger, the letters never reached Romeo. Further than this, the friar could not follow the story, nor knew more than that coming himself to deliver Juliet from that place of death, he found the Count Paris and Romeo slain. The remainder of the transactions was supplied by the narration of the page who had seen Paris and Romeo fight, confessing his marriage with Juliet, imploring the forgiveness of his parents, acknowledging the buying of the poison of the poor apothecary, and his intent in coming to the monument to die and lie with Juliet. All of these circumstances agreed together to clear the friar from any hand he could be supposed to have in these complicated slaughters, further than as the unintended consequences of his own well-meant, yet too artificial and subtle contrivances. The whole truth comes out. All these circumstances agreed together to clear the friar from any hand he could be supposed to have in these complicated slaughters. He's not guilty of his own well-meant, yet too artificial and subtle contrivances. So he meant well, but this was too artificial, too forced, too subtle, too complicated. Everything had to go right for these things to work out for him. Yes, could they have worked out? Sure. Was this prudent? No. There are a lot of different ways things could have gone wrong. They went wrong in this way. They could have gone wrong in other ways. Interesting that it gets sort of let off the hook here. And the prince, turning to these old lords, Montague and Capulet, rebuked them for their brutal and irrational enmities, and showed them what a scourge heaven had laid upon such offenses, that it had found means, even through the love of their children, to punish their unnatural hate. And these old rivals, no longer enemies, agreed to bury their long strife in their children's graves. And Lord Capulet requested Lord Montague to give him his hand, calling him by the name of brother, as if in acknowledgement of the union of their families by the marriage of the young Capulet and Montague, and saying that Lord Montague's hand in token of reconcilement was all he demanded for his daughter's jointure. But Lord Montague said he would give him more, for he would raise her a statue of pure gold, that while Verona kept its name, no figure should be so esteemed for its richness and workmanship as that of the true and faithful Juliet. And Lord Capulet returned so that he would raise another statue to Romeo. So did these poor old lords, when it was too late, strive to outgo each other in mutual courtesies, while so deadly had been their rage and enmity in past times, that nothing but the fearful overthrow of their children, poor sacrifices to their quarrels and dissensions, could remove the rooted hates and jealousies of the noble families. We get this interesting resolution here. This is not something that you really get in tragedy in the ancient Greek world. But here, for Shakespeare, something good does come out of this. The prince said bickering and attacking each other in the streets for all these years, and look at the way that God has chosen to destroy your children. Out of their love, because of all the hatred between you, even that was turned into a punishment. And so now, even though it's too late to save their children, there is a reconciliation between the two families. Romeo's father says he'll put up a statue to Juliet. Juliet's father says he'll put up a statue to Romeo. It does end. And that, I think, is one of the interesting features of this as a tragedy, is that it's not senseless. Tragedy was invented by the Greeks. And the Greek view of the universe is a kind of depressing one. We saw it already a little bit, I think, with Homer, Odyssey, the underworld. Ultimately, ultimately for the Greeks, human life is pointless and meaningless. Yes, there's some good things while you're alive, but then you die and you're sort of still there, but it's pretty terrible. And sometimes the gods are good to you, sometimes they're not. And there isn't always, yes, there are certain things you can do to sort of improve your chance to change them, and there isn't much reason to it. Shakespeare, both writing much later than the Greeks, also here, I think the Christian context for Shakespeare is part of the difference. Yes, they are tragic in the way the Greek tragedies are, but here, at least in this case, there is good that comes out of a real. So all that I'll say about that. We'll start reading Cont's paper. Lots of things that come up in the plot that we've read through that will make good response. I'll see you guys soon.